Tonight it really is the mother of all talk shows. This is the Question Time panel that never has been assembled, but everyone wishes had been. This is the dinner party. Over the next 3 hours, we'll be talking to John Pilger, Andrew Gilligan, Peter Hitchens, and Peter Auburn, and Julian Assange. Tonight we're focusing, of course, on the Chilcot Inquiry report, which has exploded over the British political scene like a kind of nuclear blast. No one knows who'll be left standing at the end of it, but everyone knows nothing will ever be the same again. More than 2 million words, so I won't pretend to have read it all yet, or even read much yet. But I think we already all know that the establishment panel, which I described at the time as a panel of establishment flunkies, has delivered a verdict on the Iraq War and on the conduct of politicians and intelligence chiefs and diplomats and lawyers and one or two people who ought to have been deliberated upon have so far escaped scrutiny, but they will not from me and my guests this evening. No one, for example, in the Chilcot panel was empowered to look at the role of the media in the run-up to and the subsequent events of the war and occupation on Iraq. That's one area that I'll be going into with my guests, who are each and every one of them very formidable, internationally recognized journalists and broadcasters. Let's summarize what the inquiry found. It found that Britain went to war when it didn't have to, when all alternatives had not been exhausted. From a Christian point of view, and Mr. Blair, who we invited onto this show this evening, and his office never got back to us, Mr. Blair is never done telling us how Christian he is. St. Thomas Aquinas opined a very long time ago on the concept of just war. And the first principle of just war is that it is waged when all other possibilities are exhausted. And Sir John Chilcot found that that was not true in the case of the attack, the invasion on Iraq. Sir John Chilcot found that the British government had undermined the United Nations, of which we are founder members, and to whose charter we are legally bound. And thus the statement by the then Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, that the war was illegal now looms further into view. Because if Chilcot, after 7 years and £10 million of expenditure, has found that the decision of the British government undermined the United Nations, whose charter we are legally obliged to uphold, then that becomes a very serious matter and maybe even a legal matter. The report finds that the politicians willfully exaggerated the intelligence findings of our security services. The report finds that the warnings of the head of MI5, Dame Eliza Manningham Buller, were willfully disregarded and ignored. The report finds that MI6 and its chief then, Sir John Scarlett, or the man who later became its chief, but the man who was MI6's man in this picture, allowed itself to be, I would argue, suborned, certainly co-opted by the politicians and their enforcers, like Alistair Campbell, the infamous media chief of Tony Blair's premiership. The inquiry finds that our young men were sent into harm's way, and hundreds of them were killed and wounded, and many more damaged forever upon their return by the trauma that they had undergone, were sent into harm's way ill-clad, ill-prepared, ill-equipped, and on a prospectus which was far from satisfactory, to use Sir John Chilcot's very establishment form of words. When he says that the legal basis of the war, as defined by the then Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, had been reached in a, quote, far from satisfactory way, you can be sure that if I had been writing those words, it would have been more powerfully expressed, but it wouldn't be as powerful as expressed by Sir John Chilcot, a trustee of the establishment. And it's worth remembering here that the entire legal office of the British Foreign Office stated over and over again to Tony Blair and to their boss, Jack Straw, that to go to war without the authorization of the United Nations would be illegal. And Elizabeth Wilmshurst, one of those legal officers, had the courage and the integrity and has the honor of having resigned her powerful, important position in protest at the disregard of the Foreign Office's legal officers over this matter. Far from satisfactory, says Sir John, far from satisfactory is the outcome of all of this. Mr. Blair claims, and claimed again, over 2 hours at a press conference on the day of the launch of the report, not only that he would do it all again, he asked the families of the bereaved families of the dead soldiers, to take a moment to stand in his shoes, which as a piece of narcissism must be pretty hard to beat when you are addressing people whose husbands, whose sons, whose fathers gave their life's blood in a war that Chilcot says did not have to be fought and was far from satisfactory in the establishment of its legality. Mr. Blair claimed and claims that this is all hindsight, all seen in the 2020 vision of hindsight. But that's not true, because many of us, and I speak personally for a moment, told him, in my case face to face, nose to nose, eyeball to eyeball, in the library corridor of the House of Commons, outside the gentleman's lavatory to be precise, just days before he launched this invasion and occupation of Iraq, I told him every single thing that would happen, that did happen, and so did many, many others. Dame Eliza told him that far from protecting us from terrorist outrage, joining George W. Bush's attack on Iraq would make us less safe, not more safe. Experts by the dozen, by the score, told Mr. Blair that if you smash into the Iraqi state like a man kicking a hornet's nest, then the results will be, to say the least, unpredictable and probably highly dangerous. President Obama himself has said that the growth of ISIS, the metamorphosis of Al-Qaeda, which now cascades around the world so violently, so horrifically, flowed directly, like blood, from the Bush and Blair invasion and occupation of Iraq. Only Tony Blair appears still to be in denial over that fact. Now, many people paid for their stand on Iraq. Catherine Gunn paid. Elizabeth Wilmshurst paid. One of my guests tonight, Andrew Gilligan, paid. The head of the BBC, Greg Dyke, paid. The then editor of the Daily Mirror, Piers Morgan, paid. I paid when I was expelled out of the Labour Party. Hundreds of British soldiers paid far more with their blood. But the people who took us into all this haven't yet paid anything at all. The verdict is in. It is guilty as charged. But what's the punishment? When does it come? That's what we'll be exploring tonight. Now, there can be few, if any, I think none, more celebrated international journalists than my next guest. He has been exposing lies and malfeasance, crimes and war all over the world as long as I have been a conscious person. I used to follow his coverage of the war in Vietnam. That's how old I am, and that's how long his track record as journalist and broadcaster supreme. John Pilger joins me now. John, welcome.
Thank you, George.
What did you think overall of the Chilcot report?
Well, I thought there were two things about it. There was the Chilcot report, the headline report. They clearly stage-managed a PR version of it, which was aimed at Blair. There's no question about that. They went out for Blair. And the other version, locked away in its 2.5 million words, is quite interesting. There's some very interesting information there, not especially new to those of us who've known the price that Iraq has paid over the years, but it's there. And the other is the reaction of the public, and to some degree, I suppose, the reaction of the media. The public, I think, have almost used the publication of the Chilcot report to vent its feelings about what was done in its name by the Blair government in Iraq. So I suppose it's a mixed success in a way. I mean, it's interesting. There are two things left out of the headline Chilcot report. One is the Iraqis, the effect on Iraqis, and yet you delve into the body of the report, and it does acknowledge, not only acknowledge, but it actually details the scholarly reports that, beginning with Johns Hopkins Lancet report that said that 650,000 Iraqis had died as a result of the invasion. It goes into that and gives that the credibility it deserves, though its headline report, of course, still hangs around 150,000. That's one of the most offensive things. The minimizing of Iraqi casualties, and the media and politicians have been doing that for a very long time. But, you know, I think the public understands. I think we can have faith in the public reaction.
Well, I'll tell you, John, I was on Question Time last night. It came from Brighton. It was a very typical Brighton audience, for all that means. It was overwhelmingly white people. It was overwhelmingly middle-class people. It contained several, at least 3 or 4 soldiers, and to a man and woman, vibrantly, they were doing as you've just described, expressing their extreme anger. I mean, if someone who had really supported the war had been on the panel, it might have gotten very, very angry indeed. Lord Faulkner affected to have reflected and now was against the war, and that partially disarmed it. But the response that I've had on the streets of London today to the question time indicates that you're right, that people had reached a verdict, but it has now been validated somehow by this report for all the imperfections of its headlines.
Yeah. I think it's a pity that what I objected to was that which we knew, you knew, I knew, and many, many other people knew, only, as you say, appeared to be validated by an establishment report. This knowledge has been with us for a very long time, and I think what is left out of this, of course, is the period leading up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. That is the period from 1991 to 2003, when the United Nations imposed probably the harshest embargo seen since for hundreds of years, I would have thought, like a medieval siege. And the death toll from that, according to the former Assistant Secretary of the United Nations and the UN humanitarian coordinator who resigned, Dennis Halliday, is 1 million people. So that's even before the invasion started.
Yes. John, so there's one area I wanted to explore with you. The media, and you said that it's the media response was telling, it was overwhelmingly hostile to Blair, including the very sections of the media that had been Blair's echo chamber for the war and had maintained a steady drumbeat, which tried to march the British people into that war. What did you make of that?
Well, I think because they know Blair is a criminal, and that he is, as Prime Minister, he bears a great deal of responsibility for this huge crime. When you say overwhelmingly, I don't know about The Guardian. They were all over the place.
As always.
Well, yes, but they supported Blair. They called Blair mystical at one point. They were so supportive of Blair. They promoted Blair. And of course, the Observer never apologized for its disgraceful support for the war. Now, those are the two liberal papers. I suppose, look, they were trying to distance themselves from Blair. The establishment is now saying, without saying it, that Blair is a major criminal figure, whether or not he's prosecuted as such.
Well, that's what we will be exploring. John Pilger, it's a pleasure and honour to have you on the mother of all talk shows. That was John Pilger, one of the greatest of all journalists in the English language. He laid out, I think, started what will be, I think, a very intensive exploration of the Chilcot Report, the things that are in it, the things that aren't in it, the things that ought to be in it, and what happens next. I said in my talk-up that I felt that the verdict was in, and it was guilty as charged, and the issue, the biggest issue that now arises, is who will be held to account, because if you are guilty of a blunder, John called it a crime of this magnitude, then first of all you must be punished for it, because that would not be moral if you weren't. But even more importantly than that, if you're not punished for it, why would subsequent leaders not do it all again? Now, we had one legendary figure already. Now we have another. He, as the head of WikiLeaks, has done more to bring the truth of what happened in Iraq and many, many other places than anyone else alive on the planet. And we won't go in tonight to the price he's paid for it. Just say that it is a significant price and not for a short time either. He is calling us now from the Ecuadorian embassy, where he has spent year after year paying that price. He's Julian Assange. Julian, welcome to the show.
G'day, George.
I don't know if you heard your compatriot, John Pilger. He began to talk about the role of the media in all of this. You know a thing or two about that, including about the Guardian. How would you respond to what John said so far?
Well, I agree with him about the media. I think it's quite interesting to see the positioning that has occurred. So now you've got, as John said, the very same establishment media, such as the BBC, the Observer, pivoting to try and blame Blair. And you can see what that's about. On the one hand, it's adapting to what the new feeling is about who has the power in this country, the United Kingdom. On the other hand, it is taking that bullet of the Chilcot report and grabbing it midair and throwing it towards Blair in order to dodge it themselves.
I think that's right. What should have been said, first of all, about the war? You have, as I said, brought the truth, more, you and your organization, WikiLeaks, more than anyone else in the world. We wouldn't know many of the things we now know if it were not for WikiLeaks. And the backlash from the establishment against WikiLeaks, against you personally, has been crushing. It has not crushed your spirit, but it has cramped your ability to continue to function. Will Chilcot now open up some more space? Will more Chelsea Mannings come forward? Will more whistleblowers come forward? And are you, WikiLeaks, in a position to expose what they bring?
I think so. The last chapter of the Chilcot report, interesting, it's the last chapter, chapter 16, is on civilian casualties and my analysis of the Iraq War materials that we published, more than 400,000 classified documents, and what the US record keeping was on the civilian kills. They had records of more than 160,000 casualties, more than 105,000 deaths, just between 2004 and 2009. That is used in the Chilcot report. Now, interestingly, the British government did not, as far as the Chilcot report could determine, keep accurate figures as to civilian kills. The United States also claimed that. Now, while the United States did not add up the civilian kills and put them down on a piece of paper that then became public, nonetheless, each time one of its soldiers came across someone dead in the street, or they counted the bodies after the end of a firefight, at least some of them, they noted that down and put in a database. And so it was a very simple operation to simply add up what they say all these kill records are. But they avoided doing that in such a way that became public, and the UK government did so as well. Why? Because of the political lethality to the war effort of having a civilian kill count issued by the military itself.
Political lethality. What an amazing phrase, and absolutely accurate. It's going to be lethal now, isn't it?
I think so. I just want to go back a bit because it's a bit funny for us. because we published a progenitor to the Chilcot report back in 2008. That was Stability Operations in Iraq, a classified document by the MOD, 100-page Chilcot. And that document, which you can find by searching for WikiLeaks TELIC, T-E-L-I-C, it gives a description of why the Iraq War occurred, or rather why it ended in a disaster, is because of some kind of original sin. And the original sin was secrecy. And why did there need to be such secrecy in 2002? That secrecy meant, and it's detailed in the TELIC report, but Blair did not communicate to the MOD what was going to happen, that there was a rush towards war, until December 23, 2002. Kept it all secret. Why did he keep it secret? Because he was engaging in a ruse, and that ruse was that it was just about weapons inspectors, and at any moment there could be a diplomatic breakthrough and there would be no war. But if it was exposed that in fact that he was engaging in very serious war planning 6 months or a year before, that ability to sell the war as a conflict about disarmament would have unfolded. So as a result, there was no proper post-war planning because there wasn't time for post-war planning. And the TELIC report says that even in it wasn't until the combat operations, the initial invasion itself had almost completed, that contractors were called up who would get the power back on and so on.
Well, the ruse, as you described it, is exposed in the now infamous document, "We will be with you, comma, whatever. Full stop." And that full stop is a total, unqualified full stop. I suppose the question, maybe you're not able to answer it, I'm not. We now know what happened, we now know what the result was, but what we don't really know is why. Why did Blair do this? There's another question about why the British state allowed him to, but why did he do it, in your view?
I think that's a very interesting question. I don't have all the pieces that I am comfortable to answer that. I have some guesses. Okay, so one of the things that is barely mentioned in the report, it is there towards the end, is about oil and the conversations that Blair had with BP and Shell and wanting to get a piece of the oil. That was from the neocon side in the United States. That was clearly was possibly the major element. But I look at it another way. It's not enough to explain why Blair went out on such a limb. I think that he's a politician who managed to climb up, ingratiating himself from a young age with more senior people, and in a repeat pattern with about 7 different people he served under. And so the result is he becomes Prime Minister, but the behaviour is ingrained. Now it's necessary to ingratiate yourself with the next more powerful person. And in this case, he perceived that to be George W. Bush and the United States. Even
when that next most senior person is inches from imbecility?
Well, I suppose it's even better from the perspective of someone who's trying to ingratiate, that if you've got a mark that you think you can, act the right part towards, who has power, then you can get some of that power yourself.
Yeah. He was the president's brain, wasn't he? The president's brain otherwise being missing.
I'm not sure. I mean, the social structure within the White House at that time, with Cheney and neocons and Rumsfeld and so on. Rumsfeld is a highly intelligent person, for example. There's a particular ideology that Rumsfeld had. Cheney became very wealthy as a result of the war. Halliburton, the company that he formerly headed up, became extremely wealthy in terms of contracts and so on. So one way of looking at this is particular sections of society, namely the war people involved in war industries, arms industries, oil companies in the United States and in the United Kingdom, some generals, thought that they could profit from the war, and in fact largely did profit from the war, and they were acting in their own interests, but not in the broader interests of the population.
What do you think is going to happen now, Julian?
Well, I'm quite encouraged to see how different parts of the establishment has swung behind the report and tried to pin it all on Blair. But it suggests that there is a new mood. One of the things to ask is, why did it take 7 years? 7 years, £10 million. Incidentally, the UK government has spent more than £15 million, it admits, in surrounding me in the embassy. So we have to kind of put
that in perspective
as to how genuine its desire was to quickly and comprehensively look into the war. But okay, you've got this report. It's been taken up, but only after 7 years. I think it's a reflection of the gradual decreasing in power of those people who made out during the Blair years, who got contacts and contracts and so on. As time has gone by, their power has been diminished, and the equivalent in the Conservatives has increased. And if we had seen the Chilcot report after 3 years, I think we'd be looking at a very different report. Also, I understand that you may be interviewing Peter Orband. That was probably a vital addition into making this report what it was. That is to create, he published a book, I'm sure you'll
a wonderful book,
it,
yes.
That it was, if you like, looking at all the public evidence of the Chilcot report and a few things published in the press, and putting it together to create his own Chilcot report before the Chilcot report came out.
Yeah.
No doubt Sir John Chilcot read that, as well as the rest of the panel, and thought, okay, we need to defend against all this.
Well, I think that Chilcot knew, and the state knew, that there were very grave risks to whatever remains of the credibility of the British state to producing another whitewash, don't you?
Well, they've done it in the past. I don't think, it would have been something that was viewed not to be credible maybe for Chilcot and the panelists. I think the state itself could have said, well, it was a completely independent commission, and that's the position they found. But you know that Tony Blair nominated John Chilcot for a knighthood.
He did.
And that is why he is Sir John Chilcot. So it was, if you look at, in terms of paying down your debts, it wouldn't have been so easy, I would have thought, for John Chilcot to throw that in Tony Blair's face. But he did in the end, and I think that's a reflection about the whole of society rather than about that panel, most of which supported the Iraq War themselves.
Indeed so. Julian Assange, wonderful to talk to you again. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the mother of all talk shows. Well, it's been a feast of experts so far. I stress again that we did invite Tony Blair through his office to appear on the show tonight to answer the criticisms that will inevitably be made of him, but they didn't get back to us. We're getting lots of SMS. I know a lot of people are angry about the Chilcot report, but it is not right to call for Tony Blair to be hung. The correct term is hanged, says Julian in Reading. Well, Julian, I'm against the death penalty in all circumstances, in all places, but thanks for that correction to many people's calls. Matt says, as a Labour member, now back with the party due to Corbyn and living in Glasgow, is there any way for Scottish Labour to make a unionist, socialist case and win seats back? Well, I spent a lot of time thinking about that, Matt, but I think tonight's show is probably not the appropriate time. Sir, I feel there was not enough detail in the report as to why Blair was so convinced to go to war. What did he gain? Well, my film, The Killings of Tony Blair, comes out on the 27th of July, so just, what is that, less than 3 weeks from now, and we investigate that in very, very great detail, coming to a cinema near you. And Rory in Kentish Town says, I really love listening to your show, as gratifying as it certainly is for me to imagine how Mr. Blair must be squirming for cover in the wake of the Chilcot inquiry. Nothing really changes. The Middle East is burning uncontrollably. That's undoubtedly true. Damien's on the line. He's a legend too, from Brighton. Damien, go ahead.
Good evening, George.
Good evening.
I think that although it's a voluminous report containing 2.6 million words, the document can essentially be distilled into a single sentence. And that sentence being, Tony Blair, guilty as charged on all counts.
Yes, I think that probably sums it up, yeah. Despite his, I don't know if he was being paid by the hour for his 2-hour press conference, and the ravaged look on his face and the damage to his voice, I think it was written all over his face that he knows that's the verdict, and not just of history, but here and now.
George, watching the press conference, it was just the incoherent ramblings of a madman. I mean, on the same day of the publication of the report, there were 172 Labour MPs who were otherwise engaged in a coup against the leader, and that's during a period when the leadership of the party has exceeded 500,000 people. And it's worth noting that the coup that they're engaged in was organised and incited by the very people who voted for the Iraq War. Now, I think we're getting to a point that the more thoughtful rebels are starting to come to the conclusion that they've been led up the garden path by these plotters.
Well, there are busted flush. The controlling mind and hand behind the coup against Corbyn is undoubtedly the clique around Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell, Jack Straw, Blair himself, a communications company, a public relations company, deeply tied to all of them. It's all out there now. You can't keep things secret anymore, and they have been basically languishing now for almost 2 weeks. There still are, like those Japanese soldiers that used to be found on remote islands, coming out of their foxholes, still claiming that the emperor was right and pledging undying loyalty to him. But it's a pretty pitiful sight. Damien, thanks for the call. Charles is up next. Charles, go on.
Hi, George. Good evening. Great to hear you again. And it's great to hear Damien as well.
Yeah, fantastic.
From the past.
Yes.
Look, I have absolutely no doubt now, we can stop arguing about it, when Chilcot says that the legal basis for the war was far from satisfactory, what he really means, of course, is illegal. But he's not going to say that. But what really does it for me, and this will be etched in my mind forever, is that Tony Blair presumably took us into war on the basis of weapons of mass destruction. But, of course, Bush wanted regime change.
So did Blair. The documents make clear that so did Blair. The documents lay bare the ruse that Julian Assange just talked about. We'll have to package this, they were saying in terms, as being about weapons of mass destruction. But what it actually is about is destroying the regime in Iraq as a part of our plan for the region. That much is clear now, Charles.
Yes, but essentially, do you remember Hans Blick saying, give me 3 more months and I will tell you definitively, definitely, whether or not there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. In fact, the weapons inspectors were still in Iraq when
Indeed they were.
They said, look, right, everybody out, we're going to start bombing.
Well,
they didn't want them to
I was the man who asked Saddam Hussein to allow those weapons inspectors back in, to which he immediately agreed and told me, you can go outside this meeting now and tell the media that I have agreed to allow the weapons inspectors back in. Now, I'm a little ashamed of that now, because I now know that it wasn't about weapons of mass destruction at all, and Iraq was not in breach of any Security Council resolution relating to weapons of mass destruction, because there were no weapons of mass destruction. Ipso facto, you cannot be in breach.
Of course. George, you acted in good faith, no matter what is said. But look, the fact is, what, as I said, told me what Blair was all about was when he said that we couldn't do anything about the weapons inspectors anymore. We couldn't give them any time because all the troops were already in theatre.
Yes.
Why were they already in theatre? If really you're looking for weapons of mass destruction.
Well, it's a totally...
Why would you want to find out about weapons of mass destruction?
Well, you're right, Charles. It's an absurdly circular argument. We have to have a war because we've sent a lot of soldiers there.
Yes,
we sent a lot of soldiers there because we intended to have a war. Charles, thanks for the call. Sorry it wasn't a great line. Don't be a stranger. Keep calling back. Here are the issues now that seem to me important. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, says that it cannot try anyone for launching aggressive war, which the Nuremberg Tribunal in 1945 declared to be the supreme crime, the mother of all crimes, because its articles do not allow it to do so. It is including, sometime soon, articles which would allow it to prosecute people for launching aggressive war, but that cannot be backdated. That does not preclude the ICC prosecuting anybody for crimes committed after 2003. In other words, not for the launching of the aggressive war itself, but crimes committed afterwards. Neither does it stop, and this is the most important thing for me, either the bereaved families beginning legal action against Tony Blair and his other officials like Jack Straw and others, the Ministry of Defence, Jeff Hoon was the Defence Minister at the time. It does not preclude the bereaved families bringing a legal action, either as a class action or one by one, on the grounds that sufficient evidence has been adduced by Sir John to show that Mr. Blair and his gang misused public office, were guilty of malfeasance in public office. And I know for a fact that many of the families are planning just that. And most importantly, even more important than that, because they would be doing so on behalf of the whole people, it is now up to the House of Commons itself to impeach Tony Blair, to bring him to the bar of the House, literally under manners, by the Sergeant-at-Arms, by Black Rod, marching him to the bar of the House and putting him on trial before a jury consisting of the 650 members of Parliament. They could send him to prison, though they probably would not. And the members of Parliament might throw the case out. But who would want to go down in history as the man or woman who went into the lobby to vote against the impeachment of Tony Blair, having amassed all of this evidence in the Chilcot Inquiry report? So the impeachment of Blair is open to Parliament. It should now proceed. Legal action by the bereaved families is now proceeding, and the ICC should bring prosecutions for war crimes. That's my view. Now, Andrew Gilligan, formerly of the BBC, now of the Sunday Telegraph, was one of the people who paid a price, not a blood price, but a career price, for seeking out the truth of what was happening back there and then. His skill and dedication to doing so needs to be remembered, and those who brought about the destruction of his BBC career need to be held to account. And I'm wondering how he feels now after the vindication of the Chilcot Inquiry. Andrew Gilligan, welcome to the show.
Hello, George.
Now, what did you think when you heard Sir John, this august figure of the British establishment? You feel vindicated?
I was very pleased. Yeah, I didn't think it was going to be as strongly worded as it was, but I suppose he must have thought that having spent 7 years and £10 million on it, he ought to give us our money's worth, and I think he did. It was a shattering verdict for Tony Blair and the government, and it was much more strongly expressed than I expected.
Now, I've been searching, Andrew, for the answer to this question. The more I read it and the more I think back on it, the question why is the biggest one in my mind. Why did Tony Blair do this? Why did the British establishment and the state not stop him?
Well, first half of that question, why did he do it? I think he just miscalculated. He thought it was going to be easy and quick. He had already been through, of course, Sierra Leone and Kosovo. Kosovo had seen a lot of the same kind of controversies, people on the streets demonstrating against it, lots of the left against it, lots of predictions that it would destabilise Europe and send back British soldiers in body bags. None of that happened. It was easy, it was quick, it was over without any British casualties at all, and then it was forgotten within a few months. And I think he thought that Iraq would be the same, and he could get away with it. He probably thought there was something in the WMD line that could be found, even if it, as we know, he sexed up the nature of the threat. And he thought he would win influence with George Bush, who would then do more of what he wanted in foreign policy. He thought he would send a message to bad guys all over the world. That's basically what I think he thought. But all those, of course, were the miscalculations of Tony Blair's life.
But the British Constitution, though we don't have one, is supposed to have checks and balances within it. It's supposed to have separation of power. We're supposed to have a professional civil service that isn't suborned and co-opted by the political masters. We're supposed to have a legal system. We're supposed to have an attorney general. But it turned out that none of that mattered.
That's right. Everything failed. And everything that's supposed to protect us failed. The civil service, in the person of John Scarlett, and all the rest of them became Alistair Campbell's co-conspirators. The judiciary, in the person of Lord Hutton and others, completely failed to understand what had happened. Parliament didn't hold the government to account. It became an instrument for persecuting David Kelly, my main source, and it showed that all the institutions of the British state, which are supposed to protect us from bad decisions, failed, and the only institution, the only sort of estate of the realm that actually worked, the only estate of the realm that did its job, was the fourth estate, the press, or the BBC, and of course, as you say, consequences for me and the BBC were pretty bad for our doing our jobs.
Now, you mentioned David Kelly, your main source. If David Kelly committed suicide, why have they locked up the papers for 70 years?
Well, I'm pretty sure he did commit suicide. I think it would not have been in his in anyone's interest to kill him. Frankly, they must have known that he was no longer an obscure civil servant whose death would pass without question. They must have known, even if you do believe that the government goes round knocking off its own employees in fields in Oxfordshire, which I don't actually, then it just wouldn't have been in their interest to kill him, because it would have, anybody with an iota of sense would have known it would have created precisely the scandal and the crisis that it did for the government. So I do think he killed himself. I think he was put under intolerable pressure by the government, by the Downing Street spin machine, and he was, as you know, he came forward to his bosses, saying he'd spoken to me. He was told that he would be protected, his anonymity would be protected, and that promise was broken. He was outed to the world by the Ministry of Defence and Downing Street. They leaked a whole series of clues to journalists, enabling them to guess his name. They then confirmed it to anyone who guessed. One newspaper was allowed to put more than 20 names to the MOD press office before it confirmed it was Kelly. Then after he'd come out, then he was paraded at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which is the obviously a harrowing experience for him, and under the pressure of that kind of interrogation in the glare of the cameras, he said something which wasn't true, and I think he must have been terrified that his reputation and his job would be at risk. And actually, I don't think he was right about that, but I can understand why he thought that. So that's why I do think he did commit suicide.
Now, what happens next, Andrew? Do you agree with my thesis that the families of the fallen soldiers will begin individual or maybe class actions against the government which failed them?
I'd like to see it, but the trouble is, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion of this, and the path to legal action isn't clear. I mean, it's difficult to know. On Blair personally, for instance, I'd absolutely love to see him face some kind of consequences, and I think that's what that you can see the sort of palpable longing of the British public for that. But I must say, it's difficult to know precisely what law he has broken. He's obviously not a war criminal in the sense that, Radovan Karadzic or the Nazis or somebody were, and he didn't deliberately set out to kill large numbers of people. That was the result of his recklessness and his deceit, but it wasn't his intention. And as you know, I mean, there is no sort of statute of war crimes in British law which covers what Blair did. There is a thing called a crime of aggression, but that doesn't apply. Britain hasn't signed that bit of the Rome Statute, which is the statute governing the War Crimes Court. So, I mean, there is some talk about impeachment, some talk about taking his Privy Councillorship away. Those would be, I think, worth trying, because I do think there was a clamour for some kind of retribution for the disaster that they were taking us. But if we don't manage that, I mean, we can take some satisfaction from the fact that Blair is ruined. I mean, this is the verdict of history on him, and it is utterly crushing. This is the final verdict on Blair. That's why he looked like death warmed up at that press conference the other day. That's why he spent 2 hours pleading with people not to call him a liar. He knows that this is the final verdict of history on him, and it is utterly devastating.
Of course, his lieutenants continue to swagger around, at least on social media, Alastair Campbell in particular, but they too are effectively devastated by this report, yes, aren't they?
They have had life sentences in the court of public opinion. Alastair Campbell knows that he will be forever defined by this, just as Blair was. He will be forever defined as a liar and a bully, and as a key henchman of the most disastrous decision in post-war British foreign policy. And it was again, I mean, they'll say things like, "Oh well, Chilcot didn't say." In fact, Chilcot specifically said they didn't insert false intelligence into the dossier. Well, that was never the allegation, of course. That was only the allegation that they tried to say. The allegation I made was that the government sexed up the dossier, that they, in other words, was a charge of exaggeration. And that's clearly substantiated by Chilcot. Chilcot says that the intelligence on the weapons of mass destruction was presented by Blair and Campbell with a certainty that couldn't be justified. And you can see that in the documents released by the inquiry and previous inquiries, which show people like Campbell, Jonathan Powell, Blair's chief of staff, demanding of John Scarlett, the man in charge of writing the dossier, the head of the Joint Intelligence Committee, that they transform possibilities into probabilities, they transform probabilities into certainties, they remove caveats, and that's how the sexing up took place. So I'm very pleased with the result of the inquiry.
Andrew Gilligan of the Sunday Telegraph, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Chilcot report. But I took him down briefly the highway of the strange death of David Kelly. As it happens, I don't agree with his analysis, and it's important to say that his analysis was his analysis. It's not necessarily ours. It's not necessarily the family of David Kelly. Perhaps that's an issue that needs to be visited separately. Alan Doddridge says Blair learned to ingratiate himself to senior people, culminating with W. That's echoing Julian Assange's analysis earlier. Dan says Bush conned Blair, but who conned Bush? And Adnan says premeditated murder means life. A premeditated war which cost 1 million lives must also mean life and 1 million nightmares. Adrian says, with Blair clearly not having served the public, should the public be paying thousands of pounds a week on his security? Well, he certainly needs security, but he ought to be paying a bit of it himself. We go into this in my film, The Killings of Tony Blair, which is out shortly, and will illuminate further on that. Roddy Hanrick says neither George Galloway or Andrew Gilligan dare mention dual nationality US admin neocons. Well, there you go, Roddy. I just did. Now, let's summarise where we are. We're looking at the Chilcot report, what's in it, what isn't in it, what ought to be in it, and what happens next. We've had John Pilger, we've had Julian Assange, we've had Andrew Gilligan, who bravely stood by his report, which turns out to have been utterly vindicated. You'll remember that Gilligan was chased out of his job, and his boss, Greg Dyke, was chased out of his. In parenthesis, he wouldn't have ended up at the FA, and, well, who knows how history might have been different. But the effect, the crushing effect of political interference on the BBC by the Blair gang at that time is still felt today and influences how the BBC conducts its business today, as anyone with eyes to see has already noticed. We'll be talking to Peter Hitchens, a journalist of the right, but another man of truth. Later in this half hour, a man who, if he had been listened to, we would not have been in the mess that we are now in. So don't lose sight of this fact. It's not just that 1 million people have already died. It is that they are still dying at the rate of hundreds most days. The killing isn't over yet. The disaster is still in spin. The kaleidoscope has been shaken, but its pieces have not settled yet. So I've got some tweets to read. I've got so many I can't get through them all. I'm very sorry for that. Peter Watt says, great show. How many of the MPs who voted for the war had their family members on the front line? Well, precious few, Peter. But as I said at the time, these people are always ready to fight to the last drop of somebody else's blood. Sarah says, it's great to hear George Galloway and Julian Assange on Talk Radio. I love the mother of all talk shows, and I'm glad it's back. Listening from Derby. Stephen's on the line from Scotland. Let's hear from him. Stephen, go ahead.
How are you getting on there, George?
I'm doing fine, by the grace of God. Thank you very much. What do you want to say, mate?
Well, I totally agree with Tony Blair done. And I don't care if it was Tony Blair or anybody else that was in power, George. Because you've got to actually remember, Saddam Hussein, it just wasn't about weapons of mass destruction, George. There was thousands and thousands of children, innocent people getting raped, murdered and buried in graves all over that country. And he was quite right to go in there with the Bush administration, because see if the ball was in the other foot, what would other countries do? Because that man there was a dictator. He was a horrible man. And if I was the Prime Minister, I'd have it in there, because, and I hear these families nowadays shouting about the 140-odd people that were killed, but these people signed up. They knew what they were signing up for in war, for the army, the military, the RAF, the Navy. You go way back to the Battle of the Somme and the Korea and all these other wars that we had. General Haig, I would say, was a man that should have been up, maybe court-martialed, not Tony Blair. And I think the country should take a step back and congratulate that man, because he saved innocent lives in countries that we'll never ever step foot in through no fault of our own, so too far away. But as a civilised nation, George, we shouldn't sit back and condone that sort of behaviour for anybody, no matter the country they're in, George. So I think yourself and other folk are bang out of order.
Well, that was probably a wind-up, but let's treat it as if it wasn't. Civilized people we are, said Stephen. And insofar as we are, let's review what we did. We invaded and occupied a country that we didn't need to, had no legal authority to, and we did so on the basis of a gigantic falsehood, namely that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. This is the rock on which the whole thing founders. You see, Iraq was not in breach of any United Nations Security Council resolutions on weapons of mass destruction. It did not have any. It turned out that Saddam Hussein, the dictator, was the one telling the truth, and the leaders of the so-called free world, the civilized world, as Stephen would like to call it, who were telling the untruths. They were doing so either deliberately or because they made a big mistake. They were either fools or they were knaves. I'm not sure which would be worse. But the end result is 1 million people are now dead. 179 of them were our own sons. Stephen thinks they signed up for it and therefore just have to accept that they were killed. But nobody signs up to be sent by their government to a war that is unnecessary, that has no legal authority, that is based on a falsehood, and nobody signs up for the kind of carnage that we saw in Iraq, mainly, overwhelmingly, suffered by Iraqis when other options were available. All of that is straight from Chilcot, not from me. Now, our last caller may or may not have been a Rangers fan, but Jerry in Motherwell declares that he's a Celtic fan. Jerry, go ahead, sir.
Hi, good evening, George.
Hi.
The last call dismays me, and I think that's symptomatic of the political spectrum in the UK at the moment. Very, very insular thought process. Tony Blair's a very lucky man. He's not in The Hague just now. I don't think it was foolish, George. I think it was deliberate. I think that oil and the contracts to be won for an inverted commas rebuilding the country was a driving force behind what they did. And whilst Saddam Hussein was not a very nice man, to say the very least, when we're going about as a country supporting Zionists and supporting Saudi Arabia.
Well, Saudi Arabia is Iraq's next door neighbour, and they're our best friends.
Well, listen, one man's terrorist and all the rest of it, and I think some of the biggest terrorists, and if you go through history, are the Americans and the British. Listen, when a million people die, you need to take stock and say, very much saying, I made a mistake, but then in the next breath say, but I'd do it again.
But I'd do it again, yeah. Actually, Jerry, there's been several of them have said they would vote the same way again, even though the motion that they voted for was entirely, and now I was there, as you know, entirely conditional upon the existence of weapons of mass destruction. So these people are saying they would vote for the same motion again, which was conditional on weapons of mass destruction, even though they now know there were no weapons of mass destruction. That must be close to a definition of insanity, no?
Is it insanity, George, or is it the school ground bully that wants what he wants and he'll take it by any means necessary? I think, some of the British people, British psyche, have not quite let go of the fact that the empire no longer exists. They still think they're big and strong, and they'll take and try and colonise whoever they want. The Iraqi people, certainly, would imagine, would feel safer or liberated, since 1991, when we first tried to do what we did in the Gulf, and we don't learn lessons, George, and I never think we will.
Well, 1 million of them are now dead. Millions more are widowed or orphaned. The country has broken up into dozens of pieces. ISIS controls almost half of the country, where it crucifies people and cuts off their heads and eats their hearts. and burns their churches and liquidates the minority religions, and has spread across the region into Syria, into Libya, into many other parts of the Arab world, and of course into our own country also, Jerry. 7/7 was the anniversary was yesterday, though nobody much marked it, because, of course, it flows ineluctably, as President Obama has said, from the decision that Bush and Blair made to invade Iraq on false pretenses, whether deliberately false or just idiotically false. And as I said, is it better that you're ruled by fools or knaves? I'm not sure the answer to that, Jerry.
I certainly don't think he's a foolish man. I think he's a very intelligent man. I think he
had the benefit of an expensive Oxford education that you and I paid for, Jerry.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, we're still paying for him. His crocodile tears filled no one, least of all me. If he doesn't end up in the Hague, George, I think he can count himself very, very lucky.
Hail, hail, Jerry, the Celtic fan in Motherwell. I'm a Celtic fan myself. Well, we're talking about the Chilcot report. We're talking about Iraq. Later we'll be talking about the Conservative leadership contest between the two women, one of whom will become Britain's second woman Prime Minister, and whether or not there ought to be a general election to validate that thereafter. But first, I want to talk to one of Britain's greatest journalists and columnists and polemicists, a man with whom I have profound political disagreements, though one or two surprising overlaps also, and one of those is over the war in Iraq. Peter Hitchens, in the Mail on Sunday, has been writing peerlessly now over a very long period of time and exposing much of what has now been validated in the Chilcot inquiry report. And he joins us now. Peter, thanks for coming on board.
It's a pleasure.
What did you overall think of the Chilcot report?
It was better than I expected, and it's tougher than I expected. I was puzzled by some aspects of it. The apparent exoneration of Alistair Campbell seemed to me to be quite funny. But I think that we just have to put up with that kind of thing. But it's better, I think, than a lot of people expected it to be. There was a feeling that they hadn't really been very forensic and they might have missed the point. But in fact, they uncovered some fantastic pieces of information, including the note saying, I will be with you, whatever, which I think really completely explode a lot of the excuses made. And they reduced Mr. Blair to a trembling, almost weeping figure of fun, which I think is probably...
You think that's condign punishment enough?
Well, I don't know. I think it's probably as much as is going to happen. Part of me feels sorry for him, because I don't think he ever really understood what he was doing, then or later. I don't think he was ever equipped for the task which was thrust upon him. He was always a figurehead rather than a real Prime Minister. Secondly, because I do tire a bit of the way in which people pour all their score on him, many of them people who I remember being in favor of the war at the time. Now, people say, oh, well, come on, everybody was in favor of it, except for the left wing, who, of course, are against every war, just or unjust, and therefore would have been against it whatever happened. But the trouble is that if I was capable of seeing that it was a stupid and foolish and dangerous war in 2003, I have no special prophetic powers, but if I was capable of seeing that, then anyone could have seen it. It wasn't that difficult. People wanted to believe in this kind of thing. It's part of a national mindset, which I intend to attack in coming years with a new book which I'm planning. This sort of the worship of the idea of a good war. Based on the belief that all wars are like the Second World War, and that the Second World War was an uncomplicated crusade against evil, so that everybody we ever attack is Hitler. Anybody who ever criticizes that attack is Neville Chamberlain. You'll remember Charlie Kennedy was being accused of appeasement when he opposed the war, for instance, and the people who are actually demanding the war, the politicians who are demanding the war, always think that they're Winston Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt. And this is a serious problem. This strange belief in this alleged good war has taken over our national mind. And we fall for it time and again. We're being prepared for it again in relation to Russia. The portrayal of Vladimir Putin as a new Hitler, the ridiculous suggestion that Russia is an expansionist power, when it's actually given up hundreds of thousands of square miles voluntarily without a fight. It's all the claims that anybody who suggested treating Russia as a member of the Committee of Civilized Nations is appeasement. It's all the same pattern, and you see now we're dispatching troops to, I think, Estonia and Poland. And you may not know this, but last week we actually had British troops in Ukraine.
I didn't know that.
No, it's not. It hasn't been. There was an exercise, an American-headed exercise in Ukraine in which British troops took part. I've been trying to find out all day whether Parliament was ever asked whether they should be deployed in this country with which we have no alliance and which is a war zone, and I haven't been able to get an answer.
Well, I actually don't agree with you about Blair just being a figurehead. I think he effectively staged a kind of coup inside the British state. He became a kind of Bonapartist figure for a
but you pay him too much of a compliment there.
Well, I know he's not Napoleon.
He didn't have the intellectual capacity to be a Bonaparte. People around him did. Alistair Campbell, I think, is a person of immense political force and belief, and actually knowledge. Whatever you think of Alistair, and oddly enough, I quite like him in a way. He's a tough, resolute, well-informed person who knows what he fights for and does what he knows, and I think that is that has to be recognised. Blair is historically, politically, geographically, culturally extraordinarily ignorant and extraordinarily uninterested. What he really wanted to be was Mick Jagger. And the closest he could come to being Mick Jagger was to be Prime Minister, which I think probably for him will always be a second best. But I think he had the intellectual equipment to be Mick Jagger, but he didn't have the intellectual equipment to be Prime Minister.
Well, he didn't move like Jagger, but he definitely stopped a lot of people from moving again.
Well, there is that, yes, but it wasn't just him. And the point is, when you talk about his takeover of the Labour Party, it wasn't him. He himself, as I say, was used by. He was, I think, found by certain elements in the Labour Party some years before he became leader as a sort of anti-Michael Foot. They really wanted someone who was the opposite of Michael Foot in almost all ways, and youthful, telegenic, and not burdened with too much in the way of intellectual baggage, and they found him and they groomed him for many years to become leader, and then he became leader. But I've never got the impression he fully understood the project that he was pushed to the front of.
Now, the media has, as you rightly say, pretty comprehensively decided to throw the book at him. They've effectively absolved some others. Alistair Campbell, I would argue, is one. But the one big thing, and you've been writing about this, and I look forward to your book. I hope it's out soon. It's very timely.
Well, I haven't begun to write it yet. So
well, hurry up, because it's time for it.
I've only just signed the contract.
Okay. But here's my point. If Blair and his acolytes are not punished, if they're not held accountable, what's to stop other subsequent prime ministers doing the same, which has effectively now been happening? It happened in Libya. We have done exactly to Libya, and we have played exactly the same kind of role in Syria that we did in Iraq. So the lessons are not learned.
And what is to stop it has to be Parliament. And this is the problem. Parliament did, in the initial stages, very effectively stop David Cameron's first adventure in Syria. And it's an enormous relief that they did. And we did a lot of damage in Syria. And one of the things people don't understand about the modern world is that so much aggression is conducted covertly and indirectly, and through proxies, and through all kinds of backstairs forms of war, from people power revolutions to aid being given to supposed democracy movements, whatever they may be called. There's an awful lot more intervention going on than would appear on a newsreel. You don't necessarily see the tanks rolling in, but an awful lot of destabilization was achieved in Syria without us ever getting involved in bombing it, for instance. And indeed, the creation of the civil war in Syria by various Western and Gulf forces is one of the biggest scandals of modern times, and the devastation that it's wrought on the lives of innocent, uninvolved, non-political people in Syria is appalling. And someone you ought to be made to answer to that. But I suppose this is where those of us who have a religious belief and those of us who don't diverge. I think the only form of justice which actually is ever in truth applied to people like that is an eternal justice. And I don't think that humanity has ever devised a system whereby power can be held accountable by actual civil courts. It doesn't happen. Most of these people get away with it, but I think one can just only hope that there is a justice elsewhere. And
there will be a judgment day, Peter Hitchens, for them and all people, as you and I both believe.
I think so.
This is the mother of all talk shows. Michael?
Hello, George. Before we get started, George, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to have the call. A long-time fan.
Thank you.
First time call.
Okay,
I used to listen to you guys on the years ago on the LP,
yes.
I think it was.
Well, it was on Talk Sport for 7 years, but we're back. We're back.
Talk Sport.
Yeah.
Talk Sport with Carl from Pladstow.
Exactly.
And all of those guys.
God rest his soul. He's passed away now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I hope you can appreciate. Before I start, I'm not trying to attack you. I'm totally one of your fans. So anyway, so there's so many topics at the moment, but I understand that you're dealing with the Chilcott report tonight.
Yeah.
So what's annoyed me the most is that our friend there is able. I say our friend, he's not a friend. The man's able to stand there and pretend again that he's not lied, and he's saying that there was no dishonesty and no deception, etc., etc. So I've been reading. I read a post today on the Canary, which no doubt some of your readers are familiar with.
It's very good, by the way. I read it every day, the Canary. Very, very good.
So there's a post on there which basically outlines a press strategy to influence public opinion, to soften it in order to facilitate military intervention in Iraq. And that's dated the 11th of March 2002, copied to Alistair Campbell and Downing Street press office. So if Mr. Blair is saying on the one hand that he had no prior agreement with the Yanks to steam into Iraq, then why do we have a thorough press campaign as outlined in said letter about how to soften up the media and soften up public opinion for that? So yes, he may be able to say that there's no evidence, no cold printed evidence in Chilcott report that...
well, not yet, although this sounds like an important story. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. And
I know you said that. I saw you on Question Time when you said that the other night. It was very good.
And it's the case. And of course, as Julian Assange said, many more whistleblowers now will be more keen to come forward with evidence that may well end up in court. Michael, you're right to make the point that the propaganda campaign, with the aid of a media echo chamber, was mounted
everyone needs to know that, George. Everyone needs to know that, but they don't realise it.
Well, I can show you my scars because I was one of its victims. I mean, it's only today that the Sun newspaper removed.
Well, Charlie was picking on you. Charlie was picking on you the other night, saying that you left. Or you got kicked out, and it's like, you got kicked out.
Yeah,
why did you get kicked out?
Well, quite. The Sun and many other newspapers printed my picture and called me a traitor. They called Charles Kennedy a traitor. They put a picture of Charles Kennedy up next to a snake and said one of these is a reptile, venomous reptile that spits out poison. and the
and
other...
the other one is the other one is the same.
Yeah, no, I mean...
It was a despicable time in our politics.
It was
I'm
really
sure
despicable. Michael, thanks for that call. Excellent one.
No, not at all. I'm glad to have
you.
spoken to you, and I hope I'll call in again next time.
Thanks, mate.
Take care.
Please do. Colin, go ahead, sir.
The guy, Jerry, Celtic supporter for Glasgow, I agreed with everything he said. I agree with Chilcott report. It was the war was based on a lie, so that's not my issue. The issue is something that he said. He said American and British troops for terrorists. I can't put up with that, George. I really can't.
I don't think that he said that, although I'll listen back to it later. I don't think he said that, Colin. I think he said the British and the Americans were terrorists. I think he meant Bush and Blair and Cheney and Rumsfeld and those who brought terror to the Middle East in such magnitude. I don't think he was talking about individual soldiers. I certainly am not. It would be an outrage if soldiers who were ordered to go into this unjust and unlawful war based on a lie were somehow blamed for it or held to account for it. But I don't want to fight a proxy war across the football divide in Glasgow, Colin, so I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks for the call. 0844 499 1000 is the number to call. You call us, we'll call you back. And you can text, of course, talk and your message to 87222. You can tweet, of course, Talk Radio or me. What would have happened if Saddam had managed to procure nukes from a cash-strapped Kazakhstan? Doesn't bear thinking about, says Don in Aberdeen. No need to think about it, Don in Aberdeen, because Kazakhstan is the least cash-strapped country on the earth. Kazakhstan is one of the most wealthy countries on the earth. Iraq didn't try to procure nukes from it. So there's no need to build still further castles in the air to somehow cast some doubt about the central thesis of the argument on this show. But nice try. No cigar. Peter in Liverpool's up next. Go ahead, Peter.
Hello, George.
Hi, go ahead, sir. Yep.
Right. Men of honour. I consider what happened to you was because you were a man of honour and you still are.
Thank you, Peter.
There's not much honour left in any walk of life.
I'm afraid there's not.
From the top down to the MPs. The way they carry on and call themselves humans should be banned.
Well, they call themselves honourable gentlemen and ladies, but their behaviour is anything but. As Oscar Wilde once said, the more they talked of their honour, the faster I counted my spoons.
That's correct. You know, where I live in Liverpool, it's a Labour stronghold, and what the 172 has done to Jeremy Corbyn is a disgrace, because it was set up quite a while ago. They knew as soon as the referendum come, the time to put the knives in. 172 of them.
Well, they planned it long before, of course, Peter.
They did, yes, of course they did. They always do.
From the day and hour that Corbyn was elected, they were planning to mount a coup.
Yeah.
And here, how about this for a lie? And it's home, near home for you in Liverpool.
Yeah, yeah.
Angela Eagle said she decided to mount a leadership challenge because Hilary Benn was sacked. But she bought a website, Angela for Leader, 2 days before Hilary Benn was sacked.
Mandelson bought them through the private firm.
Really?
No, it's the 100 years anniversary of the First World War, with thousands upon thousands of our men and young men, 15, 16 years of age going upwards, betrayed by the elite again. All this country's ever done is betray the people who served them. Our armies, our navies, our air force. Those who sit in ivory towers, who cream in all the money, who think of nothing but power and greed and money. And you know what they've done to you? Because you've had on it and you've still got on it. What they've done to you, they've done to thousands of people throughout our history.
That's very powerful and poetic, Peter. You've almost brought a tear. You brought a tear to my eye. You might want to listen back to what I said on the Psalm last Friday.
Oh yeah.
I made the point that you just have, that the First World War was actually the greatest crime ever committed against our people, and it was committed by our own rulers.
Do you know what it was? It was a family quarrel.
Yeah. That's exactly what I said.
Quarrel, we're quarrelling over who's going to get the whatever's left by the one who passes over.
Yeah,
it
was a quarrel between cousins that cost the lives of millions of workers on both sides in the war. Peter, thanks for a truly marvellous call. I need to press on. Julian's also on the line. Let's hear from him.
Hello, George.
Hi, Julian. Where are you calling from?
I'm in Surrey at the moment, but I often call you from Reading.
Okay, go ahead.
On other shows, and I'm glad you're not calling for Tony Blair to be hung or indeed hanged. You've got to get that right.
We have to get the terminology correct.
I've been correcting it all day on Facebook.
It's very good. I don't believe in capital punishment, and there's something.
Nor do I.
There's something in what Peter Hitchens said, that seeing Blair reduced in the way that we saw him the other day, there's something to be said for that's a condign punishment enough. I don't myself agree with it, because if leaders don't face punishment and are not held properly accountable, the same crimes will be committed by future leaders over and over again.
100%. But talking of films, George, have you? I know yours is coming out. Have you seen the film We Are Many?
Yes, excellent.
Because a friend of mine is organising a screening of it. We're all going to watch it together in Henley in a couple of weeks, if we get enough people to watch it. Mm-hmm. But when I've done that, I'd want to organise a similar screening for your film, as and when it's out, or if there's a premiere.
Well, the premiere is on the 27th of July at the Curzon in the West End in Soho, and but the same night it will be shown in many other cinemas across the country.
Okay.
And the screening will be followed by a panel discussion of some quite distinguished people discussing the film and discussing these issues, and that will be telecast to all the cinemas that are taking it that day. Julian, thanks, and good luck with your Henley event. We're talking, for the moment, about the Chilcot Inquiry Report and about Iraq, though we will be talking to Henry Hill, the assistant editor of Conservative Home, after the news, about the leadership election, which now goes out to the members of the Conservative Party in the country. 150,000 or so of them will be choosing who the next Prime Minister is, and of course will be trying to deal with the questions that inevitably arise from that, particularly if Andrea Leadsom gets the gig, as she well might, because, well, frankly, I've never heard of her and don't know anything about her, and the fact that she ends up in Downing Street as Britain's Prime Minister at a crucial time in national and international relations raises some quite important questions for me. But in any case, we'll hear what Henry has to say about that. And later in the next hour, we'll be talking to Peter Oborne. Peter Oborne is one of the most significant journalists and writers of our age. He is a man of the right. He's a conservative man. He is a man who might have been expected to fall in behind the government at a time of war. And that is exactly what he did, as he is candid and honest enough now to acknowledge. He supported the war in Iraq, which makes the anger expressed so eloquently that he now feels all the more understandable. He feels, as an intelligent, educated, eloquent man, that he was betrayed by this war, and he's right about that. And his primer, Not the Chilcot Report, on sale in the bookshops, is a must-read. I told you that last week when we interviewed him. He was looking forward, or looking ahead, to the Chilcot Report. He had trepidation that it might not come up to the mark. It will be interesting to hear, as we will, whether he thinks it passed muster. Talking Iraq, talking Chilcot, and talking Tories. Talking to a Tory, Henry Hill. Was he not a good fella? I don't mean to say our next guest is a good fella. I meant a good fellow. Henry Hill, of course, was the name of the main character in Goodfellas. But there are some good fellas amongst the Tories. Let's find out if Henry Hill is one of them. He's the assistant editor of Conservative Home, and of course he's the expert to whom we've turned to get an insight into what's happening now as the Tory leadership battle goes out to the country. Henry, welcome.
Hello.
Tell us what happens now, will you? How long does this process last? Are there debates and hustings and so on? Can people still join the Tory party? Is there a £3 rate? How do people intervene in this?
Okay, so the process now is that for the next 2 months there will be the two candidates, Theresa May and Andrea Leadsom, will go head-to-head at hustings across the country, organised by constituency associations, university groups and so on. Ballot papers will be issued by CCHQ, the party headquarters, to all existing members. You can't join, unfortunately. You can join, and I urge people to join, but you can't join to vote, because to get a vote in the leadership election, you have to have been a member for 3 months for the day of the vote, which is in a couple of months' time. So I think anybody who joined after David Cameron's resignation won't be able to vote. But you should be able to turn up to hustings, put your questions to people. That's one of the things that I think that people should do, because this leadership election is how we're going to scrutinise who's going to be our next Prime Minister. So anybody who has a question and is able to turn up should do so.
So you can't now vote, so that leaves the electorate of what, 150,000 or so?
Roughly so, yeah. The CCHQ isn't entirely clear on how many members there are, but it's roughly 150,000.
Would it be fair to say, given the results in the past, Ian Duncan Smith against Ken Clarke, for example, would it be fair to say that the membership in the country is to the right of the parliamentary Conservative Party?
Probably, not dramatically so. I think that it's more it's probably slightly more old-fashioned. It's certainly more Eurosceptic. I don't think that you'll find the membership in the country is sort of full of very ideological right-wingers that you tend to find sort of on the right of the parliamentary party. It tends to be sort of attitudinal. It does mean that Andrea Leadsom, she does have a chance. I think if you look at Theresa May's polling figures, they're very strong, but most people have never heard of Andrea Leadsom. So what I've been saying to sort of whoever I've been talking to is that, yes, Theresa May has these big poll leads, but they're soft, because as the public, at least the voting public, the Tory membership, start to get to know Andrea Leadsom, she has an opportunity to overturn these initial perceptions.
And how do you think she's doing so far? I mean, I know very little about her, but I must say, whenever she's interviewed, she seems to do quite well.
Well, I think this is, she's had a bit of a rocky start because of the media sort of blitz that's been sort of directed against her over the last week over things like her CV and so on and so forth. And I actually think that might be counterproductive, because
well, it's given her profile.
It is giving her profile, and also it isn't unhelpful for a candidate in Tory leadership election if it looks like the liberal London press don't like you very much. I don't think that's going to do Andrea Leadsom any harm at all. I think we have seen, the whole reason she's come to prominence is that she had a very good referendum campaign. She's a good debater. She is a good interviewee. And she founded, or at least ran, Fresh Start, which did an awful lot of the intellectual legwork for Brexit on the Tory side. So she's clearly got something there. The question is this the right time for her? Because clearly, there are clear issues about inexperience. Her team aren't particularly experienced. She's making mistakes you wouldn't expect somebody who'd been preparing for this for a long time to be making. So the question is, maybe has she run too early? But she clearly has the makings there of a Tory leader, whether or not she makes it over the line or not.
And to what extent will Brexit be a game changer? Theresa May, of course, was a Remainer.
She was a very tepid, sort of inactive Remainer, but she was a Remainer. I think that it is a challenge for Theresa, because otherwise Theresa's quite well positioned with the party grassroots. She is firm. She takes a firm line on immigration and things like human rights. She's been quite...
Well, you say that, but actually she's presided over a total failure of Tory policy in that area.
Yes, I know, because of the fact that we can't control EU migration will be her argument, which makes the fact that she campaigned for Remain awkward. What I'm trying to say is that if this weren't for the EU, Theresa is quite strongly positioned from the party right, but, clear experience and competence. But yes, she did vote Remain. Party members will have overwhelmingly voted Leave, possibly by 2-1 margin, and they'll want to be sure that the next Prime Minister will deliver on that promise. And May has said Brexit means Brexit, but I think the challenge for her in the 2 months we have left is to really put meat on those bones, to announce her renegotiating team, to announce her negotiating strategy, to give us an idea of what she wants a post-Brexit UK to look like. So I think one of the disadvantages that all Remain politicians have going into this is that clearly they don't think there's a better deal out there than membership of the EU, because otherwise they would have campaigned to leave. So I think that they really need to sort of outsource Brexit to the politicians who do think there's a better offer out there, because those are the only people who are ever going to achieve one.
Well, David Davis, unexpectedly for me, he's a friend of mine, he's backing Theresa May. He'd be a decent guy, a former Foreign Office Minister and a Leaver, a Brexiter. He'd be a decent guy to head up those negotiations, wouldn't he?
Yes, I think it's one of the reasons it's so significant that Theresa May is pulling in a lot of Leave MPs into her support, because that means that she has quite a range to choose from when it comes to putting together a sort of a bench, if you like, for the Brexit negotiations. I think David Davis may well have a role. I would previously have said Michael Gove would almost certainly be on that team, although obviously he's had a really awful 2 weeks.
He's looking a trifle bedraggled now, isn't he?
He is. He's really put himself through the ringer these last couple of weeks. But on the other hand, regardless of what's happened, he remains one of the most intellectually powerful and coherent and ardent of all of the Tories who want to leave the EU. So I'm not entirely sure that whoever wins the leadership election, I don't know if they'll be able to keep him out of it. But he won't possibly have the leading role that I would have bet he'd have. I'd have bet money he'd have had 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. On the subject of betting money, what are the bookies saying about this contest?
Theresa May is the overwhelming favourite. I don't have the exact odds, but based on her polling figures and her public, her high public awareness ratings, I think that she is the overwhelming favourite. But as I've said, Andrea Leadsom now has 2 months of, yes, unprecedented scrutiny, and she could fall apart under it, but she also has 2 months of unprecedented exposure, and she could shine in it. So I think that if somebody was putting money on it, probably the more lucrative chance would be Andrea Leadsom, because it's not unthinkable that she could win the leadership, and if she is on the route to winning the leadership, her odds will be shortening by the week.
Well, you did turn out to be a good fella after all. Thanks very much, Henry Hill, the assistant editor of Conservative Home. Quite an interesting and cogent exchange that was, I think. Tell me what you think. 0844 499 1000. I'm very clear about this, and I've been saying it since the mother of all talk shows came back on the air. There is no case for 150,000 Tories choosing the next Prime Minister without an early general election. And moreover, I said this to Gordon Brown, to his face, when he did the same thing after Tony Blair left. And in his case, that Parliament was beginning to run out of time. This Parliament has only just begun. And therefore, picture this, that either Theresa May or Andrea Leadsom, particularly acutely if it is Andrea Leadsom, will be the Prime Minister without the people having cast a single vote for the next 4 years almost. And at a time when we are deciding our future in the world following the Brexit decision. At a time when the manifesto on which the Conservatives were narrowly elected in 2015, that manifesto has now completely changed. They were elected on a manifesto of austerity, which Brexit has just killed. They were elected on a manifesto of clearing the debt by 2020, which they have just abandoned. And many other aspects of the Tory election platform in 2015 are now null and void. So I'll be campaigning for an early general election, whoever wins, and especially if it is a woman that none of us have ever heard of. Loving this talk radio show. George Galloway on tip-top form, says Michael Smith. Thanks, Michael. Thomas White, not even the end result, is it? This will go on for years and years to come. He's talking about Chilcot, I think. Neil Clark, another brilliant writer, by the way. If you haven't read his stuff, you really should. If Bush and Blair had genuinely believed Iraq had WMDs, they wouldn't have invaded. It's as simple as that. Neil, I agree with that. The reason they'll never invade North Korea is because they know that North Korea has WMDs. The reason they invaded Iraq was because they knew that it didn't. Now, Don in Aberdeen is turning into a prolific correspondent. I can't read every SMS that you send me, Don, but I'm grateful for them. Now, we're talking about Chilcot and Iraq. I'm talking about what happens next. And I'm talking about how we hold to account people found by a 7-year inquiry to have been responsible for a disaster like the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Now, RT are reporting that there's an active shooter, like it is. Someone's telling me it's the newsreader that has to break the news. If you don't mind, on my show, I'll break whatever news I like. If you don't like it, I'll take off my earphones and leave. I've had enough of you telling me what I can say and not say on this radio show. That's your final warning. I'm telling you that the United States is breaking up into a war zone. And as I'm looking at the screens around me, which are up there, presumably to tell me what's going on, I am astounded at the accelerating problems in the United States, a country that is going around this world, projecting war in country after country, but is in fact itself increasingly resembling a war zone. Now, let me talk to Ray in London.
Thank you, George. I agree with you 100% there. Can I say that Tony Blair is a criminal. He is a total criminal. And Iraq used to be a great country. Shia and Sunni, hand to hand together. They was together. And girls and boys used to go to school and everything. But now they can't. It's complete destruction. It's unbelievable what that Blair has done. He's a war criminal. He should be he should be put into the court like Karadzic. Same thing. They put Karadzic into the courts.
Well, of course, the death toll in Iraq is very, very much larger even than the death toll in the war in Yugoslavia.
Yes, absolutely. It's unbelievable. You know, it's unbelievable why we can't put Blair. He's a finished man, complete finished man.
Well, I hope so. The question is being a finished man enough? Or does a judicial process now proceed? I know that it is proceeding because I know that some of the bereaved families are going to be bringing legal actions, and when they do, we'll see how that plays out. I also know from things that have been said already by prominent parliamentarians, Alex Salmond and others, that a process of impeachment is going to be launched in the House of Commons itself. Ray, thanks for the call and sorry for your wait. Let's hear from Omar in Epsom.
Hello, George. Nice to speak with you. I've listened to you many times. But coming down to Tony Blair's situation, you can take it one of two ways. Either high politics is amoral and everything that they do is to secure the country's borders and secure the GDP of the land. And the other side that we have to take as moral people, the public, we are venting as to what has happened because people like Charles Taylor and Milosevic and Sharadic have been taken to the ICC. But the ICC lawyers, as you well know, are saying that they cannot take Tony Blair to court for the crimes that he has committed. Why is one, and you clearly know that he cannot be by the ICC. Whether he is going to be impeached by Parliament or not is another matter. Whether class action can be brought by the people who have been affected by this war is also another matter. Oh, and the other most important thing is Iraqi people are dying even today. The country is totally chaotic.
Well, hundreds and hundreds are dying every week.
Yes, millions are displaced. So what are we actually doing? Are these radio programs and all these public speeches that are going on merely to assuage the public anger, which will psychologically and eventually vent out and weaken, and nothing happens to Tony Blair? Tony Blair, in my view, should do the honourable thing with regards to his own family and do a David Kelly. In fact,
no. We can't have we can't. No. I'm stopping you there. We're not going to have anyone calling on anyone to commit suicide on this show. Sarah says the mother of all talk shows has not disappointed so far tonight. George Galloway on great form on Talk Radio, as is Peter Hitchens. Thanks for that, Sarah. The Squire G says the Tories won the election last year. The EU referendum was on their manifesto. There is no need for an election. I disagree with that, I tell you, for the following reasons. It's true that having a referendum was in their manifesto, but leaving the European Union was not in their manifesto. And Theresa May campaigned against leaving the European Union. And the economic policies, which are now being adjusted very profoundly as a result of the referendum result, were not in their manifesto either. Indeed, it's the contrary that was in their manifesto. They promised endless austerity. They are now abandoning austerity. They promised to balance the budget. They have just abandoned the balancing of the budget. But the key thing is, in a democracy, you can't have a prime minister that nobody voted for, especially one that nobody has ever heard of. That's the position I hold. You're entitled to yours. But I promise you this, the demand for a general election will grow and grow and grow. And especially if it's Andrea, it will grow and grow and grow. That's my honest point of view, but let me have yours. Kevin says, I thought because of the dim sims, the Liberals, we now have 5-year parliaments. Well, we do on the face of it. But, as always, the British Constitution is nothing if not flexible. And it is open to the Parliament. If both front benches agree and the members agree by a 2/3 majority to ask the Queen to call a general election. And so, in fact, although we have a Fixed-Term Parliaments Act, we don't have fixed-term parliaments if the Parliament itself wants to have an early election. And it would be very difficult if a Prime Minister was offering to have an early general election for the opposition to oppose it, even if the opposition right now isn't in the best of shapes to have an election. One of the many reasons why the coup against Jeremy Corbyn is so very, very wrong. Now, a podcast of the interviews that you've been hearing this evening will be available on talkradio.co.uk. A lot of people have been asking me that, and I'm glad to say that podcast is available. Now, let's see Simon Burtonshaw. If Blair is ever man enough to meet the families of the servicemen and women he sent to their deaths, I hope they ask him this. If any of your sons had been among the British regiments destined for Iraq in March 2003, would you have given the invade order? Well, far be it from me to stick up for Tony Blair, but the answer to that is probably yes. I think that Tony Blair had become unhinged, actually. And in my last conversation with him, which I referred to earlier, just before the war, it was clear to me that this was a man possessed. His messianic character had become, in my view, and of course it's partial, rather demonic. He seemed to me in a man in demonic possession during that conversation. And when I accused him of only doing this for George W. Bush, he said, "It's worse than that, George." It was like a Rory Bremner moment. "It's worse than that, George. I really believe it." And he gave me a list of other countries that he would invade if he could. And they included Zimbabwe. They included Burma. As a matter of fact, as you'll see in my forthcoming film, he then went on to work for Burma, the very regime that he was ready to invade back then in 2003. So I think the answer to your question, Simon, is he probably would even have sent his own son into war. Willow Man asks, no war, no profits for defence contractors. And who owns American politicians? Follow the money. Well, undoubtedly, Dick Cheney and Halliburton made $30 billion out of the war. This is a remarkable fortune for a company headed by the vice president of the country that launched the war. There's no doubt that many people made a lot of money out of the war, but I don't believe that that was the reason for the war. People used to say that it was about oil. I too believe that oil played a part, and the Chilcot report does indeed indicate big oil in the picture, but I don't believe it was about oil either. It's true, as many say, they've been saying tonight on social media, it's true that Israel pushed very hard for the war, but I don't believe that the war was for Israel either. What I do believe is that this war was to terrify the world with American power, and it's one of many, many boomerangs in this picture, that what it actually ended up doing was terrifying the Americans themselves with their lack of power to actually achieve the goals that they had set. Well, I hope we've got you talking, and we're about to talk to one of the best talkers on this subject, a man whom I praised last week when we interviewed him. I won't repeat that. He knows how I feel about him, and I hope most of the listeners know of his work and know how praiseworthy it is. But he did say last week that he was beginning to be apprehensive about what the Chilcot report would contain. Let's see if he was pleasantly surprised. Peter Oborn of the Daily Mail, were you disappointed or not by the Chilcot report?
Oh, it was. I think he did the job, broadly speaking. Sir John Chilcot, I think he delivered far more robust report than I expected. He criticised many people I didn't expect him to criticise, and I think he'd done the families of the dead, the brave dead, proud.
Well, that's certainly the majority view in the country, I think. And you've had a couple of days now to delve further into it. What's caught your eye, Peter?
I think that the depth of the criticism of the foreign intelligence service, I didn't expect. In fact, I remember having a conversation with you in which we agreed it would be easier for Chilcot to go after the politicians than the permanent state. And I think that he was deliberating on the intelligence services, the foreign intelligence services.
The MI6, you mean? He was rightly praising Dame Eliza Manningham Bullard, my new heroine, of MI5. Her warnings were completely ignored by Blair, but he says that MI6 was effectively co-opted, suborned, I would say, by the Downing Street machine. The point that Peter was making, and I was buttressing, was that it is the job of the Foreign Intelligence Service to honestly report to government what they know. It is not the job of the Foreign Intelligence Service to become an adjunct of a clearly hyped up Downing Street machine. So Sir John was withering in his criticism, not just of the politicians who sexed up that which they had been given by the Foreign Intelligence Service, but who went along with the politicians and even non-elected people like Alistair Campbell, turning every possibility into a probability and every probability into a certainty, every question mark replaced by an exclamation mark, dossiers that contained not intelligence but the sweepings of the internet floor, theses produced by students turned up in a British government dossier on which we were being asked to march into war. We'll examine further the extent to which these intelligence services, the Foreign Intelligence Service I mean, because MI5 comes out of the Chilcot report smelling of roses, actually. But MI6 comes out of it smelling very differently indeed. And I'm going to explore what is going to be done about that. A crucially important Department of State has been found wanting, but it's not the only one. The Ministry of Defence sent its young men into an unnecessary war whose legality was at the very least in very considerable doubt, and based on something that turned out to be not true, sent them into battle ill-clad, ill-armed, ill-equipped, and many of them lost their lives and lost their health, mental and physical, forever. What's to be done about that? How is the Ministry of Defence to be held accountable for that? Of course, the politicians who headed it have long gone off into the revolving door that exists between government and big business, no more so than in the field of defence and war. But it wasn't only the Ministry of Defence. We now know that the Foreign Office was heavily opposed to the war, but only Elizabeth Wilmshurst and Carn Ross spoke out about it. Only Craig Murray spoke out against it. The grandees that now tell us how unpersuaded they were didn't tell us at the time when it would have counted. Why did Jack Straw, the Foreign Secretary, not stand up when he knew that his own legal advisors, his own ambassadors, his own experts in the region were telling him this is going to turn out to be a disaster? Why couldn't they let it be known by one means or another that actually we were heading like an express train down the wrong track? John Edwards tweets, George Galloway confirms my own feelings that Blair lied to stand next to the most powerful man in the world. Wow Wow says, bullies only attack those who they think are weaker. And there are many, many other tweets along those lines. We don't know, of course, whether Blair lied, because we can't be inside his head. We can't be inside his heart. We know that what he was saying turned out to be wrong. We know that how he was saying it turned out to be an exaggeration, because Chilcot has found that to be so, and we can confidently exclaim it. When does exaggeration become lying? Well, if your exaggeration is intended to march an entire army into a war, if your exaggeration is intended to persuade members of Parliament to vote in a way they might not otherwise have voted, you are at the very least guilty of misleading. And there's no doubt at all in my mind that Blair misled the House of Commons, which is one of the reasons why I hope the House of Commons will begin the process of impeachment. I'm pretty certain that they will, and I'm pretty certain that the pressure on members of Parliament, particularly perhaps Labour members of Parliament, to vote for that impeachment will be considerable. Of course, there are last-ditch defenders. There are last redoubt Japanese soldiers on the remote islands still protesting that the Emperor was right and that he was indeed infallible. But most Labour members of Parliament will have to face first their own selectorate and later their own electorate. And will they go into a lobby against a motion of impeachment? I have my doubts about that. Peter, I was making the point, as you were, that the criticism of MI6 in the report is blistering. What happens now to those departments of state that singularly failed us, like MI6, but not only them?
Well, this is an overall crisis in British government and the British state, because in the greatest moment, post-war moment, the only full-scale foreign invasion we have done since 1944, we failed utterly in every conceivable way. And I think this requires the ability of the state to come to terms with these problems. It needs to re-examine our foreign policy, re-examine the way in which government conducts business. What are our aims? I mean, what do we need to be an ally of this United States? What is our system of Middle Eastern alliances? Are we really? We're quite frankly not capable on our own of being a world power. That's a mistake. I mean, there's one question which somebody put to me the other day. If you look at the Middle East, look at Israel, Palestine, who's done more good or been more effective or been more creative in the last 30 years? Britain, with our UN Security Council status, or Norway?
Well, that's a very good point. The institutional failures are such. I've been thinking about this all day. I'm feeling towards a conclusion on it. It seems to me that the Blairites, not just him, of course, but quite a small group of people, or gang of people, I would describe them, they effectively seized control of the British state in a way that was unwarranted and used it badly. It was, in a sense, therefore, a kind of coup. They suborned the Foreign Service, they suborned the Intelligence Service, they suborned the British military, they effectively suborned the cabinet and misled, at the very least, the Parliament. And the media, much of it, most of it, was complicit with all of this. It's a kind of British coup, isn't it?
No, I think there's a great deal in what you're saying here. It's a collective failure, although Blair, of course, led it. It was a collective failure, and almost none of us, although you yourself played a very honourable role, and so did the Stop the War Coalition, which I addressed last night, saying to them. But basically, I think we do have to reassess and learn these lessons. I mean, as I said to the Stop the War Coalition, if you'd been in charge, if the chairman of the Stop the War Coalition had been Foreign Secretary for the last 15 years, the world would be a much safer place.
That's true, it's a fact, yeah.
And I do think we need to we realise that the assumptions which lie behind, the alliances which lie behind British foreign policy. I mean, just looking at one example today, we suddenly announced a great exercise going on in Eastern Europe.
Yes, we've sent soldiers today to Poland and elsewhere in the former Soviet sphere of influence. I'm not sure there was much national debate about the wisdom of that.
And indeed, there's a sort of forward policy, an aggressive policy against Russia, which I'm not sure is in the national interest. I'm not sure who drives it. We're fighting various very quiet wars around the globe at the moment. Has Parliament ever involving drones and special forces, but they've not been announced to Parliament or debated? And I feel again that that there needs to be, we can discuss that. But I mean, more importantly, I mean, as I completely agree, there was something went collectively wrong. It was like it was captured, British government. Now, one of the things you can identify is there was a neoconservative clique which captured British foreign policy making. And that neoconservative clique remained in charge under the Cameron government, the Cameron government, the successor government to Blairites, and I think now, actually, oddly enough, with Brexit, we may finally have a chance to reinstate the traditional methodology of government and re-examine our foreign policy. Maybe I'm being over-optimistic.
Well, maybe, but we certainly need to. But the point that you make, you see, I believe, because of my code, if you like, I believe that wrongdoing needs to be punished, but not just because of that moral code. Because if wrongdoing isn't punished, then why would the next leaders not also continue wrongdoing? If in fact you can do so much wrong and go on to profit very massively from it, why would the next guy and the next guy and the next woman not continue to commit these wrongdoings? So what I'm asking is, what happens now? Is impeachment a runner, do you think, in the House of Commons today?
I don't see, to be honest, I don't think that will happen. I mean, it's legal. It's within the laws of parliamentary procedure, I'm sure. Although, since Mr. Blair, who I presume we're talking about here, is no longer Prime Minister or even an MP.
No, but he's still a Privy Councillor, and he's still always touting for new jobs. He was only asking the other day, Peter, if he could be the negotiator of Brexit. He's nothing. You can't keep a bad man down, you know.
Yes, and I just don't think that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is another way. I mean, what about manslaughter? I mean, it's just gross negligence can be a felony.
Well, I believe that Chilcot has established misconduct in public office, because recklessness and negligence and a failure of duty of care, these are all offences.
Yes, and that I think could be I know that my friend, your friend Richard Heller, who I share an office with, is looking at this matter. So, but I'm not terribly well advanced on this. In a way, though, I'm more interested now in going forward. Mr. Blair, we watched him yesterday. He's a broken man, and I almost feel that this job is done.
Well, you may be right. Let's look then at where we go from here. We're about to have a new Prime Minister as it happens. It was a slip of your tongue, perhaps, a minute or two ago, but you talked about the Blameron government. And actually, Blair and Cameron were, in foreign policy terms, seamlessly connected, were they not?
Now, that's one of the great, as a Tory, one of the things which Cameron really disappointed me, because I thought he would bring a conservative rather than a neoconservative philosophy to government, but he didn't. And Instead of which, and getting involved in Libya and in other disasters of that kind.
He's deeply involved in Syria. Despite the parliamentary vote not to bomb Syria, Britain is heavily involved in the Syrian civil war.
And he also just flatly ignored Parliament's vote to recognise the state of Palestine, which I felt was an affront, quite frankly. That was Parliament voted to recognise Palestine, and that was never done. Never even attempted to do. Never just ignored it. And again, I felt that was upsetting and an insult to representative democracy.
Now, neither of the two candidates for the prime ministership have any great form on foreign policy. That might mean that they're a blank page on which good things can be written, or it might be that that they will be acted upon by other forces. What's your take on that?
If I read Mrs. May correctly, she does what her officials. She's very unadventurous. That's good and bad. She won't rethink policy, but equally, she'll be very cautious before doing anything aggressive.
Very interesting. Peter Auburn, thanks. I'll let you go. I know it's a bad line, and I'm grateful to you for your efforts to help us. Martin in Yorkshire says, George has been telling us for years what's now in Chilcot. A complete validation of your work. Well done. Thank you, Martin. Nadia says, sadly, both options, that's Leadsom and May, are rubbish. One we know far too much about, and the other very, very little. Shame no general election. Well, I hold to the view that there ought to be a general election, Nadia, and moreover, I'll take a punt and say I think there will be. David Wooldridge said on Twitter, 100% agree. The UK deserves to have a Prime Minister and not some ex-financial worker who's messed up every position she's had. I don't know if that's fair. In fact, I think it isn't. I don't think she's messed up anything, Andrea. We know virtually nothing about her, but we certainly don't know that she's messed up any positions that she's had. What are the chances of a general election, in your opinion? Asks Ferrayamo. I think good. Lewington Smythe III says, Galloway's in full flow on Talk Radio. Every word has been spot on. Glad to see him back. Thank you very much indeed for that. David says, wrongdoing should be corrected, or they will do it again. We see that with the banksters. Don't get me started on the banksters. And Lucy Kelly says, exaggeration is lying. I rather think you're right about that, Lucy. Why does the ICC not want to try him for war crimes? Asks Nazir. Well, here's the situation. Britain is a signatory, of course, to the ICC. The ICC does not have an article which allows it to prosecute states which launch aggressive war, even unlawfully, as in the case of the view of the United Nations we did in Iraq. It is going to, but not yet. And in any case, when it does, it will not be backdated to cover retrospective conflicts. You can see why the governments are playing difficult about agreeing such an article and agreeing a definition of the launching of aggressive war, because the countries with power might well find themselves in front of the very tribunal, the ICC, and they don't fancy that. But in any case, it won't be retrospective, so can't be used. The ICC cannot be used to prosecute Tony Blair for launching an aggressive war, even if it is an unlawful one. But after 2003, any offences that fall under the ICC's ambit can be prosecuted. And I don't believe we've reached the end of the discussion about that yet. Moreover, British law allows people to take action for manslaughter where negligence and recklessness comes to the attention of the courts. And I know that people will be bringing the alleged offences of misuse of public office before the courts very soon.